Okay, welcome to session 6, part B. Okay, what I want to do in this session is go over the marginal cost calculations and the supply curve calculations that are in chapter 4. Okay, the first thing I want to do is talk about how table 4.1 was constructed, or actually it's just data that the authors of the textbook give you. But here's the way I want you to analyze it. There is a farmer, and it turns out he has some land. He can use the land to grow soybeans or to grow corn. Okay, and the way it works is if you use the land completely to make soybeans, then he would be able to produce 14.5, I think it was bushels of soybeans per year or whatever the time was that it gave. Say it's per year. Um, Now, meanwhile, if the farmer starts using some of that land for corn, then it'll produce little bit less soybeans and more corn. Okay, and the book tells us if instead it devotes a little less, if he uh, uh, produces only 13.5 bushels of soybeans, he can produce 1 bushel of corn. Okay. Um, by the way, this is beyond the scope of the course right now, but the way they've done it is there's actually increasing marginal costs. You may notice that for each um, to get each an extra unit of corn, you have to sacrifice more and more soybean output. That's kind of a common assumption in economics. They call it decreasing returns. I think we'll talk more about it later on, but for the most part, they do this. The book assumes this, and it's not linear as the case we did before with the law of comparative advantage. So for that reason, if you look at the figure 4.1, that's why the graph is curved rather than a straight line. Okay. If instead they had done what we economists sometimes call constant returns to scale, then that line would have been a straight line. Like I said, it's beyond the scope of the course, at least for now. I think in a few weeks we will talk about these things. But for now, just assume this is the data, okay? Now, meanwhile, if the farmer wants to have produce 2 bushels of corn, then he can only um, uh, produce 12.4 bushels of soybeans. And notice that that decreases by 2.1. Before it only decreased by 1. Okay, it decreased from 14.5 from 1 for the first bushel of corn, and decreased 1.1 for the second bushel of corn. Okay. Next, if the farmer wanted to produce 3 bushels of corn, then he would only be able to produce 11.2 bushels of soybeans. And notice that decreased a little more here. The decrease from 12.4 to 11.2 was 1.2. Okay. All right. So you can go through that table on your own. Okay. I've reproduced it here. But here's what I want to do now. Okay. Um, we're going to talk about the cost of producing corn. Now, it turns out actually that I thought the book kind of made a mistake. They correctly stated that part of the cost of producing corn is the opportunity cost of using that land for something else, namely for soybeans. Okay. Now, there's also other costs that the book didn't mention. I mean, there's labor, there's fertilizer, there's water, there's seeds, there's a lot of other things that the book actually ignored. Okay, but for the moment, let's ignore those for like the book does. So the only costs to producing corn, let's assume, is the opportunity costs of not using the land for soybeans. Okay. Next, the book said, well, let's assume that the price of soybeans is $1 per bushel. Okay. So if the only cost of corn is the opportunity cost of producing the soybeans, if you go from 0 bushels of corn to 1, all of a sudden your soybean output will decrease by 1 bushel. A bushel of soybeans gave a price of $1, so that means you're going to have $1 less of revenue from the soybeans if you produce 1 bushel of corn. Okay, so what that means is when you produce 1 bushel of corn, the marginal cost of producing that bushel of corn is going to be $1. Okay, before we were getting $14.50. We produced one bushel of corn. Now all of a sudden the revenue from soybeans is $13.50. It's $1 less. That's what we're calling the cost of producing that extra bushel of corn. Okay. Now, when we talk about marginal cost, we mean that last additional unit. Okay. So now we're going to say, what if instead the farmer decided to produce 2 bushels of corn? What's the marginal cost of that extra bushel of corn? We'd say, well, we're at 1 bushel. Now what happens when we go from 1 bushel to 2? We produce 1 extra bushel. What's the cost of that extra bushel? Well, the answer is, well, before, when we're producing 1, we're getting a revenue of $13.50 from the soybeans. Now if we produce an extra bushel, okay, 1 more, our revenue from soybeans goes down to 12.4. That difference is $1.10. Okay, so the farmer says, when I go from 1 bushel of corn to 2, that extra bushel of corn, what's the cost in lost revenue from soybeans? The answer is $1.10. Okay, so we will say that the marginal cost of producing the second bushel of corn is $1.10. Okay, what about the third bushel? Okay, well, we were making $12.40 from soybeans. If we go to the third bushel, that revenue goes down to $11.20. That's $1.20. The third bushel of corn, that extra bushel after 2, cost us $1.20 in lost revenue from the soybeans. So we'll put this as $1.20. And then if we just fill in the table, you'll notice the fourth bushel is the difference in that. It's 130. The fifth, the difference in that's 140, 150, 160, 170 for the eighth, 180 for the ninth, and then 190 for the 10th bushel of corn. Okay. 190. Okay. Can you see these? Okay. Next. Okay. We want to build what's called the supply curve. Okay. Okay. For the moment, let's just think about this one farmer rather than the supply of corn from everyone, from the whole industry. Let's just have the supply of corn from this one farmer, okay, from that one farm. Okay, here's how we build this. Okay, what we do is first, with supply and demand graphs, we always put P, price, on the vertical axis. Okay, you've got to memorize that. Okay, so I shouldn't say this, but when we do respondus lockdown, by the way, if you're taking this class in person, we're going to do the test, and you are going to write something on your hand to cheat on the exam. Now, I'm not saying you should do this, but if you did, what I would write is a graph, and I would have P on the vertical axis, Q on the horizontal axis. Okay, got to remember that. Got to memorize that. Beat it into your head. Okay. Okay. given that, what we say is, okay, first, if the price were $1, how much would the farmer be willing to produce? So, by the way, if it's less than $1, he's not going to produce any. He's going to say, look, if I get a price of only 90 cents, I'm not going to produce any corn. It's not worth it to me. My costs are $1, okay? But if the price were $1, the farmer, let's actually, you know what, let's make it, for the moment, we'll make it $1.05. Then I'm going to go back and do like the book does. But suppose now it's $1.05. That's the price of a bushel of corn. And the farmer says, well, I can get, if I produce one bushel of corn, then I'm going to get $1.05. My costs are going to be $1. I'll make a profit of 5 cents. Okay? So I'm willing to produce one bushel of corn. Then he says, do I want to produce a second bushel of corn? Well, I'm getting a 5-cent profit from that first bushel. If I do a second bushel, the price is going to be $1.05, but my costs are going to be $1.10. He's going to say, no, it's not worth it. The costs are more than the price, so I will not produce that second bushel of corn. So what we would say is if the price is $1.05, then the quantity that he's willing to produce is going to be 1. Okay. So that means we'll have a dot right here on this supply curve. Okay. Second, let's say, what if the price is $1.15? How many bushels of corn is the farmer willing to supply? We'd say if the price is $1.15, if I produce that first bushel, I will make a 15-cent profit off that first bushel, okay, because my costs are $1. Okay, so I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to supply 1 bushel. What about a second bushel? He says, well, the second bushel, my price will be $1.15. My cost will be $1.10 for that second bushel. I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to produce a second bushel. Okay. So he says, I'll do 2. What about 3? We'll say, well, the price is $1.15. To produce the third bushel, it costs $1.20. I'm not willing to do that. So if the price is $1.15, what he will do is he will produce 2 bushels. Okay. Okay. Now, usually in economics, we talk about a continuum of goods. So we talked about, we're assuming in this example that the number of bushels of corn you produce has got to be an integer or a whole number. Okay. You can't produce 1.57 bushels of corn. Okay. That's to keep things simple. Because we've assumed that, it's slightly more complicated, and usually the supply curve looks like a staircase. Okay, it's a little bit more difficult than you need to know. It's usually what you would address in a more advanced class in economics. Okay, but what I want to do, so I think that if it were me, if I were writing the book, I would just keep things $1.05, $1.15, but that's not what the book did. So let's instead say what the book did. And what the book did is it said, well, what if the price were $1? How many bushels of corn would the farmer be willing to produce? Well, you could say, well, if he does 1, he gets a profit of 0. So he'd actually be indifferent between producing nothing and producing 1 bushel of corn. Let's assume, I think as the book does, that if he's indifferent, he's going to produce the higher amount. So he's going to say, even though my profit is still 0, I'll go ahead and produce 1 bushel of corn. My price will be $1. it costs me $1, I'll end up breaking even, but I'll produce that one unit. Okay, so it would mean that the quantity is 1. We'd have a dot at the $1 mark. Okay, what about 110? What if the price were 110? The farmer would say, I'm willing to, for the first bushel of corn, my cost is $1. I'm getting a price of 110, so it's worth it. I'll get 10-cent profit for that. So I will produce the first bushel of corn. Will I produce a second? Well, for that second bushel of corn, what we call the marginal profit, the extra profit from that second bushel of corn, will actually be 0. The price is 110 and his costs are 110. He's indifferent whether to produce that second bushel of corn or not. But the book assumes that he will. He'll go ahead and produce that second amount. He's indifferent. So for the quantity of 2, for the price of 110, the quantity will be 2. Okay. And so I won't put all the numbers, but we get, if you look at the book, this is figure 4.2. If we get all the way to 10 units of corn, and I should have, let's make this price graph a little bit higher. So we get it all the way up to $1.90. The farmer is willing to produce 10 bushels of corn, and if I've done this right, this line should look something like a straight line. Okay, and this we will call the supply curve. Okay, by the way, notice this was equal to the marginal costs that the farmer faced. Okay, that's going to be the usual case in economics. The supply curve is the same thing as the marginal cost curve. Okay, you might want to write that down. That makes a very good test question. The supply curve is always the same thing. Well, let's see. They actually have costs, but if there are costs and there are marginal costs, the supply curve and the marginal cost curve will be the same thing. Okay. Let's see. Next thing I wanted to do. Okay. So we have now, we've now addressed, this is an important concept in economics, marginal costs. Notice it was, the key was that we just looked at what's the cost of producing one more unit. That's the marginal cost. We constructed a table of the marginal costs, and then from that, we can construct a supply curve. Okay, so we've done a major thing for a introductory economics class. Okay, last session or the one before that, we constructed a demand curve. Now we've constructed a supply curve. The next thing I want to do, okay, the book discuss what happens if the price of soybeans dropped. Okay, before, in this case, marginal cost of corn, when I did it in black, soybean price equals $1 per bushel. Okay, now the book says what happens when the price of soybeans changes. We talked about this with demand curves. When a substitute or a complement in demand curves, when that price changes, that causes a shift in the demand curve. Something similar is going to happen here. So we have a price of something else, which is basically, it's kind of, for the farmer, this is a substitute for producing corn, producing soybeans. So we're going to have now soybean price equals 0.5, 50 cents per bushel. Okay, so now I'm going to write in green what happens when, soybean price is 50 cents per bushel now. Okay, okay, now all that happens, the price of soybeans drops by half, turns out all of these numbers are just going to be divided by 2. Okay, so what happens is this becomes 0.5, this one becomes 0.55, this one 0.6, 0.65, 0.7, 0.75, 0.8, 0.85, 0.9, 0.95. Okay. So now, when we're in the green case, okay, what if the price of corn is 50 cents? Okay, now, let's see what happens. Okay, the book doesn't actually write the price curve of this, but it does have table 4.3 where it talks about the new marginal cost curve. Okay, so we've already written those marginal costs, so these are exactly the same numbers that are in table 4.3. Let's now construct the supply curve, the new supply curve. Well, okay, if the price were now 50 cents, how much would the farmer want to produce? The answer is 1 bushel of corn. Now, we said he would be indifferent between that and 0 because he'd be getting a price of 50. His cost would be 50 for that first bushel, but if he's indifferent, he'll go ahead and produce it. So, what that means is at a quantity of 1, price of 50, we have a dot. Okay. Next, what if, sorry, I'm not going to have enough room. What if the price is 0.55? Okay. The price is 0.55. The farmer definitely wants to produce the first bushel of corn. He also wants to produce the second bushel. He's indifferent between producing the second bushel and not. Okay, but if we assume he's under indifference, he goes in and produces it. He'll produce 2. He will not produce 3 because the third bushel of corn would cost 60 cents. He's only getting a price of 55. So what happens is at 0.55, he's willing to produce 2. Okay, and the price is 0.6. He's going to be willing to produce 3, and so on, all the way up to when the price is 0.95, he's willing to produce 10. So here we go. That is the new supply curve. We often call it S prime, okay? A key thing we will say is at every price now, the farmer is willing to produce more. For instance, at $1, he's willing. Before he was only willing to produce quantity 1. Now he's willing to produce 10. Okay. Turns out we'd like to think that these supply curves keep going out to infinity. So if this green line kept going out, we'd say at a price of $1.10. Before he produced 2. Now he's willing to produce much more. Okay. It's a way of saying that we could say that this green line has shifted to the right from the black line. Now it's also shifted down, okay? But either way, when we say it's shifted out, that means he will always produce more at any given price than before. We also say it's shifted down. That means that even given quantity, he's willing to produce it at a lesser price. Okay, so that's the final point. I want to say from that. Okay, now, you know what? I will stop there. Let's go, and I will see you in part C of session 6.